Okay, great. So thanks for coming, everybody. As I said, I've got a very short presentation. The idea of this session is to take some ideas forward, to propose some activities and some actions, because as you know, the theme for the Global Shelter Cluster meeting, for this meeting, is impact. And one of the things that really does have an impact is the long-term effects of shelter programs and how they link into the process of reconstruction. So we have had a number of meetings around the shelter cluster where impact has been discussed, but one of the main ones was at the Ignite talk on Thursday the 22nd. If you were there, you will remember that panelists were commenting on the need to create links between shelter initiatives and development actors. And one of the development banks was represented at that meeting as one of the panelists. And this became very clear that one of the things that needed to happen was better linkages between shelter processes and development processes. So this open space is a great opportunity to take that forward, to link in with the theme of the Global Shelter Cluster meeting, and to be able to demonstrate that we want to think about this and we want to act on this and to propose back to the shelter meeting some ideas to take forward. So 3 things to set our thinking in motion. And then these are just really ideas around these areas that have come up. And so please expand on these and develop them. So focus. So is this about measuring long-term impacts of shelter, or is it about linking with reconstruction, or are they the same? Funding. Many shelter funds are specifically for emergencies or for life-saving. If the intervention makes a contribution to development, how can that funding be justified? And then working back from the other way, what are the links to development funding streams? Can development funding streams be accessed in humanitarian crises? Communication. It is difficult to bridge the gap between humanitarian actors and development banks, or is it? People might have different experiences of that. It may not be difficult. It may just be that we haven't tried very much or haven't had the time to do that. However, some people have commented that networks don't overlap. That may be part of the reason, and attitudes may not overlap either. And there seems to be little knowledge about the operation, how each other operates. So one potential proposal is to ask funding partners and implementing partners about positions and mechanisms which relate emergency shelter and housing reconstruction. So we could suggest that. But what I wanted to do is open up this discussion and use most of this session in a discussion about what steps would we need to take in order to build relationships between shelter and housing reconstruction. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and go back to the meeting and see what we can come up with together. So please do either raise your hand so I will see that, or write something in the chat about a comment or an idea. But this is really over to you to be able to say, if we wanted to progress this issue, how would we do it? Let's have some tangible steps to take forward. Or it may be that you want to open up an idea for discussion, and if so, then it may be that more issues, before we can propose some steps, more issues need to be discussed together. So please, over to you. Please type in the chat or put a hand up and we will come to you for some comments. So who's going to be first? I'm sure that many of you have had ideas about this issue. So let's take it on. It's a topical issue for the global shelter cluster. So let's figure out what we can do to be able to propose some activities. Okay, great, good. Thank you, Cecilia, for the first. And Chuck, yes, please unmute and do give us some thoughts.
Sure. Hi, Charles and everyone. Again, Chuck Setchell. Charles, it would be very interesting for us to get a sense of the degree, if you've looked at past disasters and crises, the degree of housing stock in those particular disasters and crises that would be categorized by you and others as informal sector impacts versus formal sector impacts of disasters and crises. I raise that because there seems to be almost a false dichotomy between humanitarian assistance and development assistance and how they work. Development assistance focuses on housing. Shelter, humanitarian assistance focuses on shelter, and we understand the distinctions, but the bridge, the understanding of housing markets and land markets, and the component of informal sector activity, and the most vulnerable populations that often occupy that segment of housing markets is often overlooked. Certainly by development actors, it's often overlooked. So I would like to get a sense from you what the research says and what the degree of impact of disasters and crises on informal sector housing. Over.
Thanks, Chuck. That's a really good question, and it's a question that I don't know the answer to, because the research, there is plenty of work that has been done about informal sector housing, and plenty of research on slum upgrading and things like that. However, that hasn't been applied and considered by how it links into any processes of shelter or post-crisis shelter reconstruction. So I think it's a hugely open area, and there are plenty of organizations working in that area who we don't talk to as part of a humanitarian response. However, I'm sure there are lessons there, and it's something that I've identified as a gap. And in my research, the subject area is too big to be able to comprehensively integrate into any of the research that I've done. But it's certainly something that I think would be really useful. I guess my only comment would be to build on some of the initiatives that have been talked about this week. For example, the Homes and Communities initiatives from NRC and CRS, which just by the words that they're using is identifying that it's not just a shelter, it's a home, and it's not just a settlement, it's a community. And I think what they're trying to do there, and I wasn't in that session, perhaps someone who was in that session can speak up for that session. What they're trying to do there, by not just the language, but by the approach, is to be able to say there is, of course, a linkage, because housing lasts. Housing is housing. It's a place to live, and you need a place to live, whether you're in a humanitarian emergency or through into a reconstruction or recovery process. And that place where you're at, the displacement lasts, and so there is a natural link by some kind of housing. Okay, so there's there's support for your point, Chuck, which is great. Very often people are affected by disaster from the informal sector. So whether that's rural or urban, but many people are in much more vulnerable situations because of the fact that they're in the informal sector. And then Arwen, thanks. There's a number of studies from recovery which focus on a continuum component from shelter to housing, and I think that's a really good point in this, to be able to demonstrate that continuum. And that's something that I think as researchers, it would be a really important contribution to this, to be able to pick up those studies, and where they do exist, and I've seen some of them, but again, there hasn't been the research focus on this to be able to figure out a comprehensive review of those issues. So, I mean, I would take that away from my perspective, to be able to say there is a great need to be able to do a comprehensive study of these continuum components, especially in the informal sector. Okay, so that is, and also I should report here that there has been discussion within the shelter projects working group as part of the global shelter cluster, that there is a real need to go back and reflect on or engage with the large responses such as Haiti. I mean, there was a Haiti 10-year issue to look back on the Haiti crisis and the response to the Haiti crisis, but not so much. It didn't really cover the long-term impacts, and so there is certainly a bit of momentum behind wanting to explore and expand case studies to be able to look at what happened in the longer term, 5, 10, 15 years. So I think that would be a very useful contribution to add to case studies. Chuck, is that your hand again, or was that is that your hand still up?
I think we have 2 CSs. So
yours is the one you've got a hand up, but
I do. I don't want to take too much time, but I do think that this continuum issue is very important. I think this issue of informality is incredibly important, and I think it actually hinders the discourse between the humanitarian and development communities. The institutions in many of the countries that we work in, the policies and regulations, really do not recognize the informal sector. That creates real problems when we start talking about transition and recovery. It's hard to link into institutions and policies that don't recognize a majority, if not the overwhelming majority, of activity on the ground with regard to housing. Over.
Thanks, Chuck. And if I could come back to you and build on that a little bit, tell me about funding mechanisms to be able to bridge between humanitarian response and longer term development. I mean, what's the best way to justify funding which can bring a program into the development sector, whether that's informal or formal?
A couple of things, and again, I'll try to be as brief as possible to allow others to speak. Most humanitarian funding focuses on shelter, be it emergency or transitional shelter, and transitional shelter attempts to help inform and help define that humanitarian development nexus, as we've been talking about the last 4 or 5 years, and the continuum and et cetera, the gap, all of these kind of metaphors of one sort or another. But the distinction, I think, for humanitarian funding, certainly within our government, is that we focus up to transitional shelter, seeking to create designs and processes that facilitate follow-on reconstruction. And the development funding that our agency has and other agencies have that are on the development side will focus on housing and reconstruction in the classic formal sector manner. So the linkage between, again, what we can do in terms of facilitating permanent longer-term housing is actually rather limited as a development agency, because we don't have, if you look around at the development agencies around the world, very few of them have an appetite for housing and housing reconstruction. Very few of them have in-house resources and expertise to do so. It's difficult, it's problematic, it's time consuming. Development agencies don't like to do that. So the housing and housing reconstruction is actually quite low on the agenda of most development agencies. Over.
Well, that's a really interesting comment. Thanks, Chuck. Based on what we're saying, and I wasn't aware of that. That's really interesting. Lee, are you going to come in on that?
Yeah, let me comment on a couple of items here that follow the same thing. Number one, first of all, everybody who knows me knows I think in curves. So the emergency process really starts the whole development process, if you want to talk about it that way. And like Chuck had said, the emergency process focuses on just getting what I call getting people stabilized so that they can begin to handle their own life requirements without external aid, and positioning them to have the minimum resources necessary to partake of forthcoming recovery and development. Now, when that aid starts, it's usually done by grants. It's given away free. But as you move into recovery, you're going to have to change from granting to financing. That's a different type of process and dynamic that needs banking people, that needs government, that may need taxes issues. There's all kinds of stuff to come in there. We don't really have a good way of defining in the nexus how we move from granting to financing. In the same way in the nexus that we don't have good processes for moving from the kind of minimal construction activities that we do into the more involved construction activities that go along with housing development, building code, zoning, and those other activities. We need to have methods in that set of disciplines that move us forward. If we analyze this thing as a curve, as a scenario of going from nothing into whatever your final development programming is, there's a whole series of these kinds of threads that we need to tie together individually in order to tie together them comprehensively. One of the processes that we don't have is we don't have a management system that takes us across this set of processing. The management system that's available that we use in order to do emergency response is not a management process that can carry us into the recovery and development areas. So there needs to be a management system over all of what we're doing to make that work. That takes us into what people keep talking about, the integrated approach, but we really haven't defined that approach in terms of the nuances necessary for operational on the ground.
Right.
We got a long way to go. Over.
Thanks, Lee. That's really good. I'm going to come to Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you for referring to the homes and community discussion we had yesterday. Happy to further discuss that, but I have a different question. The average length of a family is displaced has changed. It was at some point for 5 years to 12 years, and some estimate look at 26 years now. When humanitarian agencies were mobilized in Jordan to respond to the Syrian crisis, we soon realized that it was not going to be a 5-month response, with rather a 5-year response, and that already looked far away. We're close to the 10-year mark. So my question is, have the length of a time a family is displaced been an argument that is sufficiently integrated into our project design, justification, and programming? Thank you. Over.
Okay, great question, Miriam. Thank you. And anyone, please chip in. Hilmi.
Thank you, Charles, for the opportunity. I completely agree with what VHA colleagues said about the reconstruction and the development actors' engagement. But at the same time, traditionally, the humanitarian agencies have focused on kind of the short-term emergency assistance, even occasionally in some places transitional shelter assistance. But the outlook into how these transform or can transform into a longer-term permanent housing was lacking. It is getting, it is improving, but we are not there. So in the longitudinal impacts of our program, we try to tackle that or look at it in 2 case studies. I will share the link. One in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, and one in northern Uganda. One is more of a conflict nature, and one is more of a natural disaster. The earthquake response. Now, the issue we have is we need to understand the rationale for how the program was designed in humanitarian sphere, even before we think of longer term reconstruction. Oftentimes you would find this is not available, even in shelter case studies publication. We have very little information on why a certain type of program methodology was employed. We lack baseline data on housing stocks or the other things mentioned earlier about informal settlement, how it's affected, or other things. We don't, as humanitarians, don't look much into these kind of issues and data. So therefore, when you are thinking of looking at 2 years later or 3 years later, 5 years later, you don't have much to compare with. It is kind of because there are so many environmental issues that affect people. It's not just our program. So we need to have a good baseline, first of all. And the second thing is going back, the 2 case studies we have tried to do is it's after 10 years. And there's so much we should do, even with community or some sort of a monitoring the place before you go in a longer term to measure. Yeah, so so in order to do that, I think we need some sort of develop some sort of a methodology, not just monitoring and evaluation reports at the end of the program. It won't help. We need a better methodology. What we need to have as a baseline data. If you pick 5 things that we need to know at the start of the program, so that we can measure this more systematically. Yeah. Okay, I will stop there. I will link the study. It's not much, but yeah, thank you.
No, thanks, Sylvie. And it's been, let me just say that the Interaction, supported by BHA, have been very active in this area and have been leading the ground in this, commissioning these studies. And I completely agree. I think it's a big takeaway for me as well, to collaborate on designing some kind of methodology so that we have a baseline and we know what we're measuring. Otherwise, we will get a bunch of quantitative information. No, I was right. Qualitative information, which might not be comparable. Anyway, the kind of information we need, kind of information we can gather at the start of the process, and what we need to measure later on is really crucial. Thanks, Helmi, for uploading. So okay, so just to Miriam's question, yes, my understanding of displacement and the length of time of displacement is is that displacement is planned only as a short-term measure, but then it's like the emergency has to, in order to justify the funding, the emergency has to be defined as a continuous emergency, and there's a massive amount of funding going into stabilizing displacement sites. And if nothing else, that funding, we must be able to demonstrate that there are longer term processes which need to be integrated, which mean that funding is justified. So I think, again, it's a huge question. Okay, so we've got Tonya, thank you for your question. The traditional transitional core shelters after Haiyan, that's really a very interesting, relating to Bill Flynn's point as well, that kind of transitional or temporary shelters can develop into substandard housing. So it's a huge point there. So some really big issues for us as a shelter. What I'm thinking about is everybody's raising some really big issues that we need to consider as a sector. I don't know if anybody's got any comments or knowledge of current discussions about the nexus. Maybe there is a relationship between wider humanitarian conversations. And Olivier just put something in the nexus. Because I'm not aware of those conversations that are going on, but maybe there needs to be a link into nexus conversations as well. But exactly, the Bangladesh issues is really interesting, and thanks, Olivier, for that link also. Really interesting stuff. Any final comments? Would anybody like to make any final comments to close off the session? You put them in the chat or just unmute at this stage. I think there's enough of us to be able to make that happen. Okay. Hilmi, is that a hand again?
No, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Your hand was.
Yeah, I need to take it off.
It just came up as. So Chuck, is that your hand again, or do you have a final comment?
Yeah, it is.
Right.
I think one of the reasons why humanitarian shelter, following Bill's comment, can sometimes become substandard housing is that there's no investment subsequent on the development side. It's a possibility, and we've seen it happen in a few places where humanitarian shelter, in particular transitional shelter, again becomes the platform for longer term recovery. Not impossible to do, but when we see it as substandard housing, it's an indicator of lack of housing actor, development actor, investment and support. That's fairly clear. Last point for me, I'm sorry to grab some more time. Last point for me, the issue of coverage is something that we haven't talked about. We globally have a very, very low and poor performance record with regard to the coverage of identified needs for shelter. Each disaster and crisis in the course of a year, if you look at the global cluster, shelter cluster data, we're rarely above 25% in terms of coverage of needs. And I think we need to be thinking that through that very, very strongly with how do we increase coverage, how do we do so modestly, and how do we link that to the transition to longer term development? Over.
Thank you, Chuck. A really good final comment to end on, because I do think that it's a point that's been made by others and also by the global shelter cluster leads, and I think the way that they're thinking is to be able to, if we get better at understanding impact, we can then get better at demonstrating that the money invested in shelter can create longer term impacts which are beneficial for development too, and in that case may be able to attract more funding into covering that need initially in a crisis, because the money will be seen to be value for money, not just plugging a hole. Great. Thank you, everybody. A really interesting set of issues. This has been recorded, so we will be able to share the recording with you, but I will also write up a list of issues that have been discussed in this meeting and share it with you all and feed it back to the Global Shelter Cluster and see what we can suggest as next steps. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Thank you very much. A really interesting conversation.